Okay. Ooh, there it is. It works fine. All right. Hello and welcome. Hopefully you are all here for SOC of Religion, SOC 376, and got my email. I'm assuming, as probably people didn't see my email, and people will be sort of trickling in the door, as they notice the sign on the door to our normal room. We will be back in the normal space on Monday, unless they tell me otherwise. But the screen wasn't working on Wednesday when we met, and they're putting in apparently the new screen, and they'll have all the connections going. So that room should be where we're at for the rest of the term. This is just a one-day engagement in this room. Hello. Okay. I'm just trying to get my bearings here. Alrighty, so let us start. All right, so Slido for today. Now, I think the class is still full, so I don't know if some people dropped or kind of moved on. Just for maybe people who weren't there on the first day, or people who just joined or whatever. Because it's a fairly big class, do feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. But if you're, feel kind of shy in a class of almost 100 people, I use this as a kind of Q&A system throughout the term. It's called Slido, and basically what you do, you go to slido.com and enter this code, or you scan this QR code on your phone, and it brings up like a Q&A page where you can type in some questions. So before I get started today, if anybody has you're here for SOC 376? Okay, perfect. I know, very confusing. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, like if you want to ask any questions about the syllabus, about the course, about anything like that, do feel free to throw it in the chat here. And I will answer those questions promptly. And if something comes up a little bit, feel free to use it as we go through the class. I've got a bunch of these kind of scattered throughout. I can dim the lights just a little bit more. I want to turn these ones off. I don't know why these lights bug me. That will turn everything off, except the ones I want to turn off. Okay. I see how this is going to go. I assume that those are the podium. Nope. All right. I don't know. I don't like those lights, and I want them off, but they will not turn off. All right, whatever. I'll deal with it. Okay, so obviously, this is sociology of religion. So we're going to start in on our content today. And like the first slide said, we're going to kind of delve into the question of what is religion from a sociological perspective. And as I kind of alluded to last time, this is a far less straightforward question than you might assume, right? I think, we have this kind of definition of religion in our heads. Like, I might have trouble defining exactly what it is, but I know it when I see it. But that in itself, I think, is where we get into some trouble. Okay, before I start with that, though, I do want to just kind of make, I guess, a point or a distinction about kind of even the study of religion in the way that we do it in sociology, right? A lot of the discourse in sociology of religion, and you'll see this, in psychology as well, and in a lot of the social sciences, has this idea of the secular versus the religious as kind of one of its core assumptions, right? And one of the things that I kind of want to make the point of, and this is something that, probably in the last 3-4 years, I've really come to appreciate, and specifically through the work of a historian, right? And his name is Tom Holland, which is always kind of funny because you have to make the distinction between the guy who plays Spider-Man in the Marvel movies, because that is also Tom Holland. But no, Tom Holland, the historian, is a British historian. Very good, properly a historian of antiquity, right? The Roman Empire and Greece. But he's done a lot of work kind of going forward on things like the rise of Islam, And then on his most recent kind of big book was a book called Dominion, about essentially the effects of Christianity on kind of Western society in particular, and the way that he thinks it sort of shaped the West's values. Now, we'll talk about Tom a little bit later in the course as well. He also hosts a podcast called The Rest is History, and it's really, really good. You know, they go through, 5-10 episodes on a particular historical moment. I think the last time I saw they're doing, what's the deal with Marie Antoinette, which is always kind of fun and interesting. And he's a really good historian. He's a really good communicator as well. Okay, now one of the things that I've kind of come to appreciate with Holland's work, and one of the kind of points that he's made, is that this distinction that we make in Canadian society, in British society, in American society, and broadly in the West, between the secular and the religious, very properly is a kind of idea with a really long heritage in the West, but one that isn't broadly shared kind of globally with different kinds of religious systems. And very particularly, this question, what is religion? As though religion is somehow separate from culture, that religion is separate or, a choosable thing, right? Something that you get to select as an individual, is a deeply kind of Western way of thinking that, Holland will suggest is deeply shaped by the Christian heritage of the West. And in particular, the idea, right, the split between, say, the religious and the secular, in a lot of ways, the way we think about it comes down to us from from late antiquity, a late antique kind of philosopher and thinker, Augustine of Hippo, more commonly known, say, in Catholic circles as Saint Augustine, right? I mean, if I shouldn't make assumptions, but if you've ever taken comparative lit, you often read Augustine's Confessions or portions of it as a sort of introduction to the autobiography. A very famous philosopher from antiquity. And one of the kind of really notable things about Augustine is Augustine was living essentially right at the end of the Roman Empire in the western part of Europe, right? So he was living through the collapse of the Roman Empire. And this shapes his worldview in particular ways, and it forces him to sort of, he's a Christian, it forces him to sort of think about the world in a very particular way, because, from the time when Constantine, the Roman Empire, had adopted Christianity as his religion, first making it tolerated and then making it kind of the official religion of the Roman Empire, about a century before, basically, since Augustine made it the official religion of the empire, this idea of empire and Christianity had kind of gone together, right? There was a unity between religion and the state in the way that it had been during antiquity, right? The pagan religions were all integrated into the state in major ways. Christianity had come up as an upstart, but then became the religion of the Roman Empire. But as the Roman Empire starts to fall apart, right, and the Western Roman Empire will collapse in the 5th century, in Augustine's lifetime, basically, there's this big debate going on in Roman society as to why this happened, right? And one of the things that the kind of remaining pagans or non-Christians have in their head is that, the Roman Empire collapsed, Rome was sacked multiple times by Goths and Visigoths and Vandals, ripping through the Roman Empire. By the way, just funny historical facts, Goths and Vandals are both words that come down to us from Latin, and not in a good way, as the people who wrecked the Roman Empire. So we still find that, in English. But yeah, faced with the end of the Roman Empire in the West, right? The Eastern Roman Empire will go on well into the 15th century. That's a completely different story. That's very interesting, but not the point of this little aside. A lot of the pagans are like, the reason Rome fell is because they had abandoned the gods, right? And turned to this upstart religion of Christianity, and it had so offended the gods that they brought about the end of the Roman Empire, and they brought it to collapse. And so Augustine finds himself, essentially having to justify what is going on. And he comes up with this concept, and he writes this in a book called The City of God. It's like 900 pages. You can buy it, on Amazon, or you can probably find free copies of it online. It's a pretty masterful philosophical text. But in this book, he makes a distinction that we're going to sort of live with in the West forever, right? And it's probably never going to go away. It becomes part of our sort of intellectual and philosophical DNA. And basically what he says is that, there's two kind of proper realms, right? There is, the world of the impermanent and the transitory, right? What he calls the Saeculum. Also calls it the city of man. And this is things like human beings, human lives, cities, empires, countries, right? These things are all part of impermanent things, right? They come and they go. And, obviously he makes lots of references to the Bible, because the Bible has lots of stories of, the Assyrians came, and then the Assyrians were conquered by the Persians, and then the Persians were conquered by the Babylonians, right? There's this whole kind of impermanence of nation states. They're not connected necessarily to the divine. And then he has, the realm of religio, or religion, which are the permanent things, right? The things of God. And so he suggests a distinction between the city of God, right, which is the permanent things, and he connects this to the church, right, the Roman Catholic Church, in this case, versus the city of man, or the Saeculum, which is essentially just the impermanent things that come and go in this world, and it's really of no concern if the Roman Empire collapses, because, the city of God will remain. And so we end up living with this distinction, right, that there are, properly religious things, and there are properly worldly things, and that those things aren't the same, right, and they don't need to be integrated, that somehow the Saeculum, right, the secular, the governance of the world, government, states, those are all separate from the things of God, the religious. And so, when we talk about secular versus religious today, we're really using language that we owe to Augustine, right? Now, that said, it is a very Western way of thinking. In other societies, even Christian ones, where Augustine didn't have the same status as he does in the West, we don't get this idea, this split between the city of man and the city of God, right? So say, even in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, that comes to be called Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, which again lasts until the middle part of the 15th century. Just a few years before Columbus sails for America, there's still an empire in the East that calls itself the Eastern Roman Empire, or just the Roman Empire. But basically, in the East, they don't view Augustine as important, and so they don't even call him a saint. They call him Blessed Augustine. And so this idea of this, the split between the religious and the secular never takes hold, which is why, you see in places like, modern day Russia, there's not this very clear distinction between church and state. They're very, very integrated, and they have been, essentially forever. Okay. Yeah, and so, in the West, like in Western culture, this idea of the split between the secular and the religious, the idea of the separation of church and state that becomes sort of entrenched through the American Revolution and through the Enlightenment is something that goes back to Augustine, right? And it's a particularly Western idea. Okay, it becomes really, really, really important, and it gets a little bit reformed again after the Protestant Reformation, right? So for those of you maybe a little bit fuzzy on, I hate automatic doors sometimes, a little bit fuzzy on kind of the history of Western Christianity, basically from, roughly the 350s till the beginning of the 16th century in 1517, there's essentially one church in the West. Right? There are heretics that spring up here and there, like Albigensians, but basically there's the Roman Catholic Church. In 1517, October 31st, like Halloween of 1517, Martin Luther, who's a Catholic monk, but views the Catholic Church as fairly corrupt for lots of reasons, he accidentally starts what's called the Protestant Reformation, or a movement within Christianity to reform the church, which ends up splitting the kind of Christians in the West into Catholic and Protestant categories, right? So at first there's, the Catholics, and then the Lutherans, the people who follow Martin Luther. But eventually, right, you get Calvinists, you get Baptists, you get all sorts of Protestants kind of springing up all over the place with different beliefs. And this ultimately leads to a much different social order in the West, right? Suddenly, church and state are a little bit more at odds, and you have, what are sometimes called the wars of religion, right? In Europe, things like the 100 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants. Basically, both of them trying to, the Catholics trying to reassert their control, and the Protestants, trying to assert more independence. And following the wars of these emergent nation states and the wars of religion, you get a sort of uneasy settlement that crystallizes during the Enlightenment into this idea that you have to have, the secular, which is government, and it has to be somehow neutral on religion, right? That religion has to be sort of separate from the state. You also get this notion that suddenly your religion becomes a personal choice, right? You can choose to be a Catholic. You can choose to be a Protestant, and you essentially choose religion based on how appealing you find it, how convincing you find it, rather than it being just who you are culturally, right? So people will convert from, Lutheranism to Catholicism, or Catholicism to some form of Protestantism, or split off and form their own churches based on these very personal and individualistic kind of categories, which is a huge change from where it had been historically, right? So we go from, religion being very cultural to it being very personal, and you have these two big changes, but they are sort of things that germinated first in the West. Okay, so I'm sorry, this is a longish aside, only a 20-minute aside for this. That question slide here somewhere. Okay, no, we're good. Okay, all right, so what happens, right? So I said this is kind of a very Western distinction, right? It's one that happens in the West, say in the Middle East or in India or in China. This idea is relatively foreign, right? In Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, Islam and sort of the state go really closely together, right? This is true of most of the Middle East. It's true of India, right, where Hinduism is very much just integrated into the whole cultural life of India. Now, what happens, though, obviously, is the age of colonialism and the age of imperialism. So Europeans, right, starting in the 15th century, and then, well into the era of the Protestant Reformation, start to go out into other parts of the world and encounter them and eventually take them over, right? So they colonize, North America and South America, and they extend sort of colonial empires, throughout Africa later, though, until the 19th century, Africa, but then East Asia as well, and particularly places like India. And they bring with them a lot of these ideas, right, that they have from sort of Western Christianity into those societies, right? So this is a distinction that Holland makes, not in the book Dominion. He's made it in sort of multiple kind of interviews about, Western ideas and how they've affected the rest of the world. But for instance, when the British, right? So the British, they go off, right? And I have the British Empire, historical development of the British Empire. The British go out, oops, I don't want my highlighter, I don't want my pen. The British go out to India, right? And they look at Indian culture and basically, okay, let me back up one step. They go to different places, right? So when they go to North America, they encounter indigenous people. And because, and they find what they think of as indigenous religions, right? Again, indigenous religion is very much integrated into indigenous culture in really deep ways. And indigenous people on, encountering Europeans wouldn't have thought like, oh, this is our religion, because it all would have been integrated into their whole way of life. Now, because, Europeans in a lot of ways don't view indigenous people and their culture as particularly elevated or sophisticated, what they do is they try to convert them all to Christianity. When they get to India and China and other parts of kind of East Asia, Southeast and East Asia, they encounter, much older, well, not much older, that's the wrong term, but cultures that are much more defined in their religious practices, right? And have like, temples and all of these things. And they categorize them a little bit differently, right? And those cultures are much more resistant to conversion, right? The British never managed to really convert all that many people in India to Christianity in the same way as they converted people in North America to Christianity, right? Just a different kind of set of things and a different set of assumptions the British bring with them. But they view India, like they look at India and they look at the practices of the people there that are, kind of religious, that look a little bit like what they think of as religion, and they say, oh, this must be the religion of people in India, right? The religion of the Hindus, which they give the name Hinduism. Prior to the British getting there, people in India didn't think of themselves as being members of a religion called Hinduism, right? This is a word that the British sort of impose upon them. Now, what happens in India, right, is you get the British ruling India for, better part of, a little bit over a century. And a lot of the Indian elite that will come to govern India is educated in Britain, right? They actually, stick them on boats and ship them to the UK, educate them in places like Cambridge and Oxford, and inculcate a lot of the ideas of sort of the West into, these people who become the leaders of India. And so a lot of the Indian elite after independence carry a lot of these European assumptions, right? Nehru, very famously, the first Indian prime minister after independence, very much carries this idea, and he very much wanted, to make India into a secular state, one that ultimately did away with religion. And India at its founding, right, modern India at its founding after independence is thought of as, a secular democracy in the way, Canada, the US, and the UK are all sort of secular democracies, right? But historically, very few other societies outside the West thought of themselves in this way, or thought of religion and culture, or religion and your identity as a person who lived here as being kind of separate things, or even being choosable. That's something that we see imposed and brought in by the West. Yeah, Brian.
When the British went over to India and they found this religion that they call Hinduism, did that lead them to travel around, like travel more to find more religions? Like, did this kind of spark this sort of?
I mean, I don't think they were looking for more religions. If anything, they were looking for, more resources, more markets, or other things that they, wanted to control or take over. And, well, when it comes to the British, tea. They wanted tea. That's what they wanted more than anything. To the point they almost bankrupted their country buying tea. Yeah, please. So yeah, I mean, it's good. It's a good question. I don't want to speculate on kind of the motivations of of historical people, only because, right, you'd have to dig into their thoughts and like journals and stuff, and that's a deep dive into history to try and figure out what motivated people to act that way. I think in large part, you just kind of carry with you certain cultural assumptions, right? And coming from Britain in, the 16th, 17th, 18th century and 19th centuries, what you carry with you is these kind of implicit categories that there is religion and there is the state, and that these things are somehow separate, right? And so when you go to India or you go to, North America or Australia or Africa, you basically find in those places what you expect to find because you've already got these categories in your head, right? So it's like, oh, these people are doing things like worshiping gods. Well, that is, that's kind of like us in worshiping God. So that is religio, right? That's religion. And, they don't have a name that for this religion, so they're Hindus, we'll call their religion Hinduism, right? And I don't want to let them off the hook, but I think it's probably more just you carry with you a bunch of ideas that you're not even aware of, and then you categorize things according to those ideas, right? You kind of put things into boxes based on the boxes you brought with you, right? Like, if you're moving someone's house, you put all the things that you think belong in the kitchen box. And that's kind of what the British are doing. It's like, oh, all of this stuff looks kind of like what we think of as religion according to our intellectual categories. And so we put all those practices into that category. Now, if you talk to people, and I mean, increasingly what we're seeing in India and in Turkey is we're seeing kind of a reversal of this, right? Where, people like Narendra Modi and the kind of, Hindu nationalist movements in India, and then the sort of more Islamist movements of, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, right? So he's the president of Turkey today, kind of are like, oh, this kind of idea of like a secular state of India, right? That Hinduism is separate from, or a secular Turkey, which you got after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Ataturk. This is an idea that we sort of adopted from the West, and increasingly what you see is people sort of rejecting that idea. They're like, oh, this comes from that box of Western ideas, and we want to get away from those ideas, right? Because that's not authentic to being Turkish or being Indian. Does that make sense? Sorry, does that kind of answer your question? I'm sorry, I don't, like, I always hesitate on speculating on people's historical sort of motivations, because there's a lot of cultural chauvinism, right? Which is like, oh, our culture's better, we should impose things on these other cultures that would be better. But there's also just sometimes you just carry around ideas that you're not even aware of, right? Which is why, like, when you go to another country, you sometimes get culture shock, because you're just like, oh, I'm carrying with me a bunch of like ideas about how things should be done, and people here don't do it that way. And that can be a little bit shocking, right? Does that make sense? Okay, that's a good question. Other questions? I didn't intend to spend a half hour on this, but I never do. Okay, so yeah, as Europeans travel around the world, they start cataloging religions, right? So they encounter the Indigenes, the Aborigines in Australia, and they categorize what they think of as their religions, right? The same thing with indigenous people in North America, in Africa, all over Asia, right? And they class all of these things as religion, and in a lot of ways they think of that as somehow separate from governance, right? So in adopting, because after the Second World War, you get a lot of independence movements, people still go back to those Western ideas of the nation state. That too is sort of a Western idea that comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia. And they start creating governments around this idea of a secular state. And it's only later that people start to sort of reject this in different sorts of ways and merge religion and the state back together, right? So you see that during the Iranian Revolution, for example, right? And anyway, I won't go into that too much, but yeah, you're seeing today a lot of places that are sort of starting to reject this idea of this separation between the secular and the religious. So when we talk about, religion and the secular, we're using sort of implicitly Western categories to describe the world. And in some cases, right, this is going to be very awkward when discussing other parts of the world, because that distinction is very artificial to them, And a lot of our kind of basic questions, even in sociology of religion, are really Western questions, right? They're questions that come from the history of the West and the history of Western Christianity and its interaction with the state. And I mean, I guess one other thing to say just about the West is because the Catholic Church always existed, at least in theory, as this sort of independent body that was the religious authority separate from the state, there was always this idea of like a religious power that somehow was separate from the king, right? There was the king, and that was the secular power, and then there was the Pope, and that was the religious power. And sometimes those things overlapped, but often they didn't, right? I can't remember which Roman emperor it is. There's this very famous story that comes out of late antiquity of, and I can't remember the Roman emperor, but someone will find it and probably tell me. And Saint Ambrose. And Ambrose, was the bishop of Milan. And basically, this Roman emperor had done something bad. I think in winning a war, he slaughtered all of the survivors of the enemy army, right, in a very non-Christian way. And Ambrose basically told him, you have to repent before you'll be given, communion and readmitted into the church. And, the emperor showed up, with his soldiers to try and convince Ambrose to, let him come into the church and take communion. And Ambrose stood him down at the doors of the cathedral and said, no, repent, or, I won't let you back into the church. You're excommunicated and you're going to go to hell. And Ambrose wins this particular argument because the emperor comes, and, in front of Ambrose publicly confesses his sins, at which point he's readmitted into the church. But, this points in this kind of Augustinian way to the fact that, the church is the real authority. It has like eternal power, and the state is only this temporal authority, right? And this kind of distinction comes through Western history in really strong ways. There's the church, and it does its sacred and eternal things, and the state and its temporal, and these two are not always the same. I think it is Theodosius. Yes, there's a lot of Roman emperors, and like there's Theodosiuses and Maximiniuses, and I can never remember them all. And I'm not a historian of Rome, but it is an interesting period. Okay, now that only took me 35 minutes, right? Okay, on to, I think it's an important distinction. Is one I always like to make, because I just want to say, like, when we talk about this, when we try to define religion, and especially as we talk, in secularization, theories of secularization, we're talking in very Western terms. Okay, so historically, and I will say this, religion has been very difficult to define. And I mean, when we're talking about the history of sociology, we're really only talking about, maybe I should just check if there's any questions. Oh, sorry, I wanted to, before I jump in. Our secular democracy is one that separates religion from governance structures? Yes, right? So basically one that assumes that state and religious power are separate, and that they shouldn't, like, essentially that religion shouldn't have any authority over the state, and vice versa, the state typically shouldn't have any authority over religion, right? So the idea, say, in the American context, that, the state shouldn't make any law, I can't remember the wording in the Second Amendment, or First Amendment, I can't remember which one even, not a constitutional scholar either, establishing a state church, but I can't remember the exact wording. But basically, in the American Constitution, right, it says that basically Congress should pass no law that establishes a particular state religion, right? And this is like, okay, religion does its thing, the state does its thing, and we shouldn't have an official church, like a Church of England, and we shouldn't have the church having a direct influence upon the state either. Okay. Yeah, that's the idea, right? That comes from Jefferson, but that's not explicitly written in the Constitution. There's not like the wording separation of church and state in the U.S. Constitution, but the implication is certainly there. Okay. So, all right. Historically, religion really hard to define, and it suffers from two basic problems, right? Definitions of religion are often too broad. So sometimes they will bring in social phenomena that are clearly not, recognizable as religions, right? So, for example, there's one scholar, and I think he's at Concordia University, and he teaches a course on the Montreal Canadiens as a religion in Quebec, right? Now, this is a view, I think, with considerable virtue, right? The Montreal Canadiens have things like sacred symbols. They have their pantheon of saints, Maurice Richard, Jean Beliveau, Guy Lafleur, and such. But clearly the Montreal Canadiens, for all of their resemblance to religion, are not a religion. So when we start to have a definition or any kind of sports franchise, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go forward, but often we might lump in things, a definition might be so broad as to potentially, include things that are obviously not a religion. So we have to be really, really careful of that. Okay, and sometimes they are too narrow. So this is particularly true of, I think I wouldn't even say early, like well into the latter part of the 20th century, and even a lot of, say, the definitions of religion that you would find, say, in your SOC 100 intro textbook are going to suffer from this, in that they might be really, really good at, say, defining, say, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but there would be other things that, we think of as religions, say Shintoism or Zen Buddhism, that would be excluded because they're designed around, say, a notion of, gods or worship or something like that, that don't kind of appear in some of these religions. Okay, so let's go back to our history. We can kind of break down, some of the major schools into three categories, like major ways of defining religion into three categories, and then we'll talk about one. The one we'll end up with from Christian Smith comes from a different school called critical realism, but we'll get there eventually. Because this is a relatively young kind of sociological school. Okay, so basically, you have your substantive definitions. I'll talk about those, but basically, substantive definitions are about what's in religion, right? The substance of religion. You have your functionalist religions. So, Max Weber's, for example, definitions of religion are substantive. Emil Durkheim, right? The guy who put the fun in structural functionalism. Those definitions are functionalist, right? They talk about what religion does. And then you have a bunch of what you would call social constructionist definitions, right? Marxist or Freudian definitions of religion are principally about how they're built, right? And their kind of role as a human construction, as something that emerges from human societies. How am I doing for time? I got 10 minutes. Okay. What's that? My watch says 10:40. I got till 10:50. Oh, my phone says 10:41. There's a disagreement. All right. Now my watch says 10:41. Okay. I got 9 minutes. I can still do this. Like I said, Joan's my timekeeper, official and unofficial, for classes. All right. She also tells me if I've overburdened you and you need to leave early. Okay, so functional definitions. Like I said, they're based on the functions of religion, right? What religion does. And we can split these in a sense into a couple of categories, right? Social functions and psychological functions. So social functions are things like social coherence, right? So basically, everybody sharing the same sort of belief system and religion tends to bring about a lot of social coherence because everybody, shares similar values, similar norms, right? You have similar taboos, and so all of those things, it tends to hold societies together because shared values means people tend to work together and it makes it easier to cooperate if you all know what you're doing, right? And if you all have the same basic worldview, this is what the world is, this is how the world works, that kind of works really well. So, that social coherence establishes a social order, right? It tells you, religions will do things like tell you why things are the way they are and why you're in a particular place and, how you should live, right? So, I guess one of the historic kind of formations of this was things like the notion of the divine right of kings, right? So the king is the king because God put him there and God wanted him to be the king. And, you are a peasant farming turnips because God really wanted to place you on earth to farm turnips and die at 35, right? With no teeth and, of a preventable disease in modernity. You stubbed your toe, got an ingrown toenail, and died from the subsequent infection, right? Sorry, I'm being a little glib. I shouldn't be glib, but I can't help it. But right, like a social order, like where do you stand in society? Who are the elites? Who should you listen to, right? You have to listen to the priest because he's important. He was put there by God and all of that stuff. Okay, so it establishes a social order, right? You got the king, you got the pope, you got nobles and clergy, and then you got, the peasants. And that's the way the world is. Okay. And then defensive group interests. The defensive group interests is there's the them and there's the us, right? Basically, it allows you to kind of come together as a collective of people who share the same thing, right? The same beliefs. We're all Christians, right? We're all Catholics. And so we should defend our interests against, those British Protestants who are trying to, impose Anglicanism on us here in Northern Ireland or whatever it happens to be, right? But it allows you to religion allows you to cohere around, particular identities that allows you to work together to defend your interests and advocate for them in particular ways. Okay, and obviously it provides psychological functions, right? It provides stories or what you might call myth, right? And I don't want to use myth here, say, in the pejorative sense of like false things or fanciful stories, right? But it gives you a sort of mythology, why the world is the way it is, right? And religions have various stories of, if you think of, say, Greek mythology, right? And kind of Greco-Roman religion, why is the world the way it is? Why is there suffering and disease and, all of that terrible stuff in the world? It's because Pandora was a dummy and opened that box and let all of the terrible things out into the world, right? It's amazing how many times women end up being the ones who cause all the problems in mythology. I can't imagine why. Actually, feminists have very clear explanations as to why this is, but we'll go into that later. Right? I'm like Adam and Eve, it's all Eve's fault. Greek mythology, it's all Pandora's fault. I'm sure I could find a few more. All right, why are things, in Greek mythology, there's suffering in the world because of Pandora, and she opened that box that Zeus gave and said not to open, where he hid all of the terrible things because he knew that she would open it because she'd be too curious. And bang, there you go. Horrible things happen in the world. All of that kind of stuff. So, stories, right? Christianity has its stories. Islam has its stories. Hinduism has its stories. Every religion has sort of, well, not every religion, but most religions have, sort of a mythology that goes and tells us why the world is the way it is. And then symbols, right? So recognizable symbols that belong to that religion. The cross, the crescent, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, the Star of David, right? The menorah in Judaism, the chalice in Catholicism, like the cup, all the Eucharist, right? The bread that's, in Catholic belief is the body and blood of Jesus. All of that, these are all symbols that basically, the funny hats in Catholicism. Catholicism has a great love of funny hats. All of those things are part of the symbol system of a religion. And then the rituals, right? The 5 times daily prayers in Islam, right? The rosary in Catholicism, the Mass in Catholicism, the Divine Liturgy in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Shabbat in Judaism, right? These are all rituals, right? Things that basically give structure to life and work to connect people to, what what Durkheim will call the sacred, right? Which he separates from the worldly things, the profane. Okay. You can add other things under kind of, psychological functions, things like terror management, right? A lot of psychology of religion will emphasize things like terror management, right? You're worried about what happens when you die. Is it just the infinite blackness, right? Do you just return to the void from whence you came and there is nothing after death? Or is there something after, right? And I think most people want to believe that, somehow we go on after we die. The idea that you just end and you become worm food is a slightly uncomfortable one if you linger on the idea for too long. Watch, you're all going to complain that I gave you existential dread. Yeah, Joan. What's that? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like an idea of heaven and hell, or divine punishment, or again, that's at times a little bit of a Christian idea, because say in Buddhism you have like the cycle of suffering where you just get reborn until you escape attachments. So it's not universal to all religions, but yeah, a story of kind of like divine justice maybe is a little bit more of a Judeo-Christian one in some senses, not exclusively, but certainly you could put that in there as well. And I'm out of time, I assume. I got 1 minute. Why don't we leave it here? Because we'll review this very quickly on Monday and then keep moving with our functional definitions. Okay, thank you. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.